Layne Staley has been recognized by many sources as one of the most talented and unique voices of 90s grunge. He has also been memorialized and honored by many of his fellow musicians. Despite his talent, Staley spent much of his life haunted by demons. Although he ultimately succumbed to them, what fans and those who love him remember is his talented and beautiful soul. Let's dive into the beauty and tragedy of Layne Staley's life. Staley's birth was much like any other. He was born on August 22, 1967 in Bellevue, Washington, to Philip and Nancy Staley. His parents named him Layne Rutherford Staley. While they named him after his mother, whose maiden name was Layne, it wouldn't be long before there were problems. As he grew, Layne was not happy. Even as a child, Layne Staley did not feel things in half. Staley hated his middle name, Rutherford, responding with anger whenever people called him by it. By the time he was a teenager, he legally changed his middle name to Thomas, after Motley Crue's drummer, Tommy Lee. Staley's passion for music would shape his life. While other children struggled to find themselves, Staley knew what he wanted to do with his life early on. At 2 or 3 years old, he was the youngest member of his local rhythm band. At the age of 9, he wrote in his Dr. Seuss book All About Me that he wanted to be a singer. Other children often lose their childhood dreams, but Staley wasn't like other children. Staley came by his passion for rock and metal music honestly. It was his parents' music collection that shaped his early music tastes. Staley considered Black Sabbath as his first influence. He listened to all sorts of music. Bands such as Twisted Sister and the Stooges, to even more obscure bands like Ministry and Skinny Puppy. However, it wouldn't last. As Layne Staley grew older, his life became rocky. His parents' relationship could no longer survive its growing tension. By the time that Staley was 7, they had divorced. From this point, Staley was raised by his mother and stepfather, Jim Elmer. During his high school years, he took his stepfather's last name, enrolling as Layne Elmer. Without this marriage, Staley's life might never have been the same. Music remained as a part of Staley's life. Though he struggled to find his focus, at the age of 12, he started playing drums and joining glam bands. Still, there was a voice in the back of his mind that continued to whisper his true passion: singing. However, he was holding himself back. He needed a little push to become who he was meant to be. Staley almost missed the opportunity that started him on the road to success. In 1984, 3 students from Sherwood High School were starting a band, Sleaze. They had 2 guitarists and a drummer, but they needed a singer. Staley was waiting in the wings if someone was willing to give him the push. It was Staley's stepbrother, Ken Elmer, who got Staley the audition for Sleaze. Knowing his stepbrother's ambitions, Elmer mentioned to Sleaze's drummer that Staley was a singer. However, he almost didn't go to the audition, telling his mother, "Well, I'm no singer." Despite Layne Staley being exceptionally timid during the audition, he blew the founding members of Sleaze away. Bacolis recalled, "The grain of his voice was there, the soul was there." Expanding further to say, "I don't know what we were looking for. We just kind of found it." Sleaze and more importantly Staley were on their way. Most bands struggle to get off the ground. Sleaze, however, had something special. They had Staley. With Sleaze, Staley had modest success, singing with a local record company and even appearing in a small low-budget movie, Father Rock. The cameo on Father Rock appeared on Seattle's public access channel in 1985. Despite all this, Sleaze was constantly in flux. Founding member Zoli Seminate left entirely. Johnny Bacolis briefly left to play with a different band, so Staley invited his friend Nick Pollock in. It would seem impossible for a band to survive this much change. Yet through it all, Staley remained, holding it together. By 1986, Bacolis returned from his stint playing with Ascendant. Though Sleaze looked quite different than it had before, Bacolis now playing bass rounded out Sleaze. They were locked in musically. However, Bacolis also brought a new dilemma. He was no longer in love with the name Sleaze. He wanted something different. Bacolis had been having a conversation with another artist, Russ Clapp from Slaughterhouse-5, that had led to inspiration. They had started their conversation talking about a Wonderland tour, which led them to Alice in Wonderland, which finally led Bacolis to the ultimate brainstorm, Alice in Chains. Bacolis and the band loved the name, but others didn't. There was a problem with Alice in Chains, and even Bacolis could see it. He fully admits that Alice in Chains came from an idea of putting the fictional Alice in chains, which caused problems with the young band's family members. They settled on changing the name of the band from Alice in Chains to Alice in Chains. Jerry Cantrell, a guitarist playing for a band called Diamond Lie, was mourning the loss of his mother only 3 weeks prior when he had gone to a concert in April 1987 for a band called Alice in Chains. He was impressed by the raw, deep voice of the lead singer. Neither Cantrell nor Staley realized what was being put into motion. Things might have never changed if Cantrell didn't face adversity of his own. In July of that same year, Diamond Lie played their last concert, and Cantrell was once again without a gig, and more importantly, without a home. That's when fate worked its strange magic. Cantrell and Staley met in August of 1987 at a party in Seattle. The pair quickly kicked off a relationship that would change the course of both their lives. Layne Staley was the kind of person who helped others when he could. At this point in his life, Staley was working at the music bank. He was also living there. Upon hearing that Cantrell had been kicked out of his family's house, Staley wouldn't hear of it. He invited Cantrell to join him there. For over a year, the pair lived in a rehearsal space. It was there that the magic happened. Cantrell and Staley were nothing but roommates at this point in their lives. However, that was about to change. Although Alice in Chains saw modest success, playing locally and recording 2 demos in 1987, they did not last. By the end of 1987, the band had gone separate ways. Bacalus and Bergstrom would go on to form their bands, but Cantrell had his eye on Staley. Cantrell hadn't sat by idly when Diamond Lie fell apart. He'd been collecting musicians that he admired to craft a new band, one that would exceed all expectations. He'd pull in Sean Kinney for drums quickly enough, and through an ironic twist of fate, got exactly what he wanted for bass, Mike Starr. However, they still needed a singer, and there was only one Cantrell wanted. Cantrell had never forgotten the sound of Staley's voice from the first time he'd seen him perform. The deepness of Staley's voice, despite his slight frame, continued to impress Cantrell. He knew that voice was the guy he wanted to be playing with. There was just one problem. Staley wasn't interested in working with Cantrell. He had projects of his own. How, you might ask, did Cantrell convince Staley to do something he didn't want to do? Well, remember, at this time, Cantrell and Staley shared a home. And it was a home that has also doubled as a rehearsal space. Cantrell began to hold auditions for his band's lead singer in front of Staley. Every single one of them were terrible. Still, Staley resisted. Layne Staley may have been stubborn, but Cantrell was more so. He kept pushing until there was something Staley couldn't ignore. Then came the final straw, the male stripper. When Cantrell auditioned a male stripper in front of him, Staley finally caved and agreed to join Cantrell's developing band. However, Staley had one condition of his own. Staley's funk band needed a guitarist. He agreed to join Cantrell's band as a singer on the condition that Cantrell would join his project as a guitarist. A deal was struck, and Cantrell came out ahead. By the end of 1987, Staley's funk project fell through, and Cantrell's band became his full focus. Now, Staley and the band were rocking. However, they struggled to settle on a name. In their early stages, this new band played under a plethora of names, including that of Cantrell's previous band, Diamond Lie. Eventually, they began discussing adopting the original name that Staley wanted to use, Alice in Chains. To do so, however, he needed permission. He reached out to his old band to ask permission to use the name. Although Nick Pollock initially didn't love the idea, he eventually came around. Alice in Chains were off, or so they thought. It was local promoter Randy Hauser who gave Staley and Alice in Chains their big break. Noticing the band's talent, Hauser offered to pay for the group to make demo recordings. However, the day before they were set to record, disaster struck. The authorities shut down the studio in the biggest cannabis raid in the history of the state. Was Alice in Chains going to end before it started? Things were looking dire for Alice in Chains. However, they hadn't worked this hard simply to give up at the first sign of trouble. Despite adversity, Alice in Chains managed to complete their final demo by 1988, named the Treehouse Tapes. The Treehouse Tapes found their way to Columbia Records representative Nick Terzo, who signed them in 1989. They were on their way, and so was Staley. While all this was happening for Alice in Chains, Staley's personal life was also beginning to blossom. In the spring or summer of 1988, Staley met Damrie Parrott, a model and minor actress who was working in a shop called Saturdays. They quickly began a relationship, changing Staley's life forever. Quotes by many close friends and bandmates of Staley and Parrott state that the pair were perfect for each other, some even using the term soulmates. But there was a dark side to this romance. Their demons certainly matched each other as well. Parrott and Staley both became dependent on their addictions. Staley would struggle to cope with his for years. Layne Staley was growing as a talent, and it wouldn't be long before the world would know it. In August of 1990, the band released their first debut album, Facelift. This album solidified the band's unique sound, with their second single, Man in the Box. The band was rising, however, so were Staley's demons. The year was 1992, and things were about to happen for not just Alice in Chains, but Staley himself. He and Parrott became engaged, cementing the relationship everyone else called perfect. Meanwhile, Alice in Chains released their second album, Dirt. The more success that Alice in Chains received, the more consumed Layne Staley became in his addictions. Although the band went on tour for Dirt in 1993, it did not last long. Their manager hired bodyguards to keep Staley away from bad influences, but still he relapsed before the tour's end. Alice in Chains was rising. Unfortunately, Staley was falling. It was also at this point that Staley's health was visibly deteriorating, and so was his life. His engagement of 2 years with Parrott suddenly ended. Following the release of Jar of Flies, Layne Staley entered rehab and the band went into hiatus. By this point in his career, Staley's drug use and the complications from it were becoming common knowledge, as his body was showing signs of damage. In February 1996, Staley told Rolling Stones, "Drugged worked for me for years, and now they're turning against me." Although Staley could not resist his addictions, he didn't want his fans to admire his use of illicit substances. He stated, "I didn't want my fans to think that it was cool." It was one of his greatest pains and disappointments that he still got fans coming up to him bragging about their substance use. Things may have turned out differently if Staley hadn't received a final blow that he couldn't come back from. In October of 1996, Staley's former fiancée succumbed to her own substance misuse-related health issues, and Staley never recovered from her loss. He was put on 24-hour watch for self-harm. By 1998, Staley had retreated into himself. He rarely left his apartment, and he began isolating himself from his friends. On April 4, 2002, bandmate Mike Starr visited Staley for Starr's birthday. At the time, Staley was very sick. However, he refused to call the authorities or allow Starr to call. The pair argued and Starr eventually left. What he said was unforgettable.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
Staley was saying, "Not like this. Don't leave like this," as Starr left. It would be an action Starr would regret for the rest of his life. It would be over 10 days on April 17th before anyone attempted to contact Staley again. 2 days later, on the 19th, Staley's accountants reached out to his former manager, Susan Silver, with more unsettling news. They raised red flags, notifying her that no money had come out of his account in 2 weeks. Silver contacted McCallum, who returned to her son's apartment one last time. This time, there were some alarming developments. Finding mail piling up and Staley's usual silent cat meowing in distress, McCallum called the authorities. Once officers arrived on the scene, McCallum and her ex-husband, Jim Elmer, finally entered the apartment and made the most heartbreaking discovery imaginable. They found that Staley had passed some time ago due to an overdose. It would be 8 years before fellow bandmate Mike Starr would confess to being the last person to see Staley before his passing on April 5, 2002. Although Starr was never able to forgive himself for leaving Staley that night, McCallum was firm that neither she, her family, nor Staley would have blamed him. She says Layne would forgive you. He'd say, "Hey, I did this, not you." Tragically, Starr followed in his friend's footsteps, dying of an overdose in 2011. Since his passing, there have been numerous tributes to the life that Layne Staley lived. While his struggles defined his passing, those who loved him most want him to be remembered for who he was instead. He was a talented and emotional man who prospered despite his suffering. That is the tribute that those who loved him most continue to make. If you enjoyed this Fact and Need video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.